Tonight on Primetime Politics, has decriminalization failed?
Will he A, admit that his decriminalization in BC was a deadly disaster?
As the Conservative leader accuses the government of allowing a deadly program to continue, we'll speak to a mother who lost her daughter to a drug overdose and get her thoughts on the BC pilot project at the center of another debate in the House of Commons today. Also,
after 2 decades of progress towards freedom, rights, and equality for our communities, we have entered a period of backlash.
Fighting a rise in hate against queer communities. We'll speak to one organizer behind rallies that will take place across Canada next week. And which Liberal could replace Justin Trudeau as leader? We'll delve into a new poll. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. We begin this evening with the decriminalization of certain street drugs. There is, as many people know, a pilot project underway right now in British Columbia, made possible with federal approval. But the pilot continues to be attacked in the House of Commons, Conservatives using an amendment to the pilot as proof of the experiment's failure, and today asking the Prime Minister about his plans for similar projects in cities across the country.
He has a request from the Montreal Mayor, the Toronto City Hall, and we don't know what other municipalities. So either A, he believes the experiment was a disaster, or B, he plans to repeat it. Which is it?
The only way we move forward on any proposals across this country around decriminalization or other methods to support to fight the toxic drug overdose is when provinces step up and actually ask for it. Failing that, we will not be moving forward on any modifications.
Well, with more on this debate and to share her perspective, we are now joined by Debra Bailey. She is an advocate for Moms Stop the Harm, a network of families who have been affected by substance use harms and deaths. Bailey's own daughter, Ola, died from an overdose in 2015. Ms. Bailey, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you heard it right there, Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader. He was asking about future pilot programs, but you know, really at the heart of this is the question. Poilievre's assessment of the pilot, he calls it a deadly disaster. What do you make of that?
I make that's an absolute distortion of the facts, and we resent, I think, not just Poilievre, but several politicians who've been using this as a platform for politicking. You know, people are dying here, and you know, we need to be able to work cooperatively together. They're not dying of decriminalization, though, I might like to point out.
Okay, not dying of decriminalization, but you know, the BC government did ask for and receive permission to scale back the pilot. Is that not an admission that the pilot is failing, or at least not succeeding as planners had hoped?
No, I don't think so. The intent of the decriminalization was to actually reduce the stigma that follows drug users around, and it can be really quite vicious at times. I've experienced it myself. And so the idea was that a person who uses drugs could possess 2.5 grams of certain drugs for personal use. What happened was unfortunate, I think, because there's been a confusion, I think, of what is use and what is possession. So some people, and I don't think that's as many as have been said, were using drugs in inappropriate places, i.e. hospitals, we heard, etc. But I think those are few and far between. The reason that public drug use was not criminalized was because there are ever so many people here who don't have homes. They don't have a place to go to. The only place they might have is in public. But, you know, it's never been okay to use it at schools or children's parks. That was never covered. So that's kind of the unfortunate bit, is that we're marginalizing, again, the people who are already marginalizing and dying out there on the streets alone. By not stigmatizing them, we hope that they would come forward and maybe ask for help or be with somebody else. So that was the purpose of it.
That was the purpose of it. But you know, with this amendment, of course, the public drug use is going to be once again enforced. That will not be allowed. How does this then work? Because if the pilot project is to be a success, are you going to have to create more safe spaces? How does this amendment now affect what will happen on the ground?
I think more safe spaces would be great. And I also think what we need to do is stop putting in, we'll put in this little piece and we'll put in this little piece. And this, now we're going to put in decriminalization. We need to look at a total plan. So do we need decriminalization? Sure. But what are we going to do about the homeless people out there that don't have a place to use? What are we going to do about the poverty? What are we going to do about the guys in the trades who are dying alone because they have a home and they can use a loan? So we need to look at it as a holistic picture and stop just pulling bits out and thinking it's going to make a difference.
Now, Alberta is investing in its own version of a drug treatment program, investing more in money for beds, for example, prioritizing addiction recovery instead of a decriminalized drug approach. Why not focus on that kind of Alberta model instead of experimenting with decriminalization?
Well, I'm not sure that the Alberta model isn't an experiment as well, and we wish them the best. We wish them well. But right now, their overdose rate is alarmingly going up as well. So I think what all of us need to do, Alberta, BC, is look at evidence-based approaches. There's lots of research out there that can inform us as to what needs to be done. And we need to look at that evidence instead of waiting for years to look at it. I heard a doctor once said to me, and I believe it, no one needs to die from addiction. And I really believe that. This just isn't necessary. The drugs that people who are addicted must purchase, if they're addicted, are toxic. You know, they're unregulated and they're toxic and horrid things and full of stuff. And so we need to look at evidence-based approaches. We look with interest at what Alberta is doing and we wish them well. Maybe it's a combination of something like that, but I'm not sure that all their approaches are correct or that ours are.
Now, neither you nor I have a seat in the House of Commons, but as this debate is going on in Ottawa, I wonder if you had a chance to address members of Parliament, what would you say to them right now as, again, this decriminalization pilot is at the heart of such controversy?
Well, there's a real misconception that decriminalization has increased the number of deaths, and that's just not true. Some members in Parliament have saying, you know, what are you going to do? Or the last 9 days, there's been 60 deaths. You know what? That's about on par for British Columbia, 7 deaths a day. That's nothing new. Decriminalization was never intended to stop the deaths, you know, no matter what people say. It was to stop the stigma. The drugs can be poison whether they decriminalized or not. So I would say stop the rhetoric, get a nonpartisan committee if you can to start to looking at what to do. And maybe you should hire a group of experts. We have a lot in our country, and get them to prepare a nonpartisan program here that provinces could deploy. I don't think the government, anybody in government that I know of, is expert in addiction. And I can tell from what they're saying that many of them are certainly not. And it's a waste of time what they're doing. I think we need to get on with it. It's been, 8 years. I mean, my daughter died in 2015. It's just crazy where we're at now.
Debra Bailey, I appreciate the time. Really, I appreciate the insight as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, there's no Liberal leadership race quite yet, but with the party under Justin Trudeau trailing badly in the polls, many in Ottawa have started to ask, is there anyone who could replace the Prime Minister and regain public support for the Liberals? Now, Abacus Data has been looking into that matter, and to talk to us about their findings, we're now joined by the company's founder, chair, and the CEO, David Coletto. David, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Listen, I'll get into the numbers in a bit, but first I want to talk about motivations here. What were your reasons for conducting this poll right now when really the Prime Minister continues to say he has no intentions of leaving before the next election?
Well, I think there were two reasons. One was we continue to see that, regardless of what the government does today, Canadians continue to tell us in our surveys they want change. They're not thrilled with the Prime Minister. They're not thrilled with the performance of the government. And so there's, wondering about who might, if anyone, replace him, and could that matter to how the Liberals do in a future election. But also, we had that story in the Globe about Dominic LeBlanc, the public safety minister, perhaps musing about running for leader. He's obviously denied that he is organizing, but his name being floated around added another name to my list, and wanted to see how do Canadians feel about those candidates or possible candidates, and which one would they prefer to be the next leader of the Liberal Party.
Okay, so you chose some names, posited them to people who are taking part in your poll. How did you come about reaching those names? Did you choose the ones that you thought were the most high profile, the most well known? How did you come to that list?
Well, I think it was mainly from those that have been rumored to either be of interest or could be possibly good replacements for Mr. Trudeau. So obviously the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, has for a long time been talked about as a replacement. Mark Carney has been giving some speeches recently, and lots of discussion about his possible interest in the job, and whether he would be popular or not. And then a number of the other high-profile cabinet ministers that again have been talked about. So I was just sort of listening to what folks in Ottawa and outside the city were thinking and saying, and it just sort of built a list that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's take a look at some of the results right now, beginning with who might be a good replacement for the Prime Minister, preferred replacement, as you put it in your poll. And what's interesting here is that 54% of respondents were unsure, but of those that had an opinion, walk us through some of the findings here.
Yeah, so it's a good first point, is that half of Canadians said, I don't know who would be a good replacement if the Prime Minister were to step down. But clearly, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney would be top tier kind of possible replacements right now. Chrystia Freeland at 13%, Mark Carney at 11%. And then Melanie Joly, Francois-Philippe Champagne, Dominic LeBlanc, Sean Fraser, and Anita Nunn all are in the low single digits. So none of them really have all that much traction. But that being said, even the highest profile, the most well-known of these possible leadership candidates is Chrystia Freeland, and she is barely ahead of Mark Carney. And I think it really shows how wide open a race to replace Justin Trudeau would be with the broader public. Now, keep in mind, Canadians as a whole don't get to select the next leader of the Liberal Party. You'll have to either be a member or a supporter, depending on how the party ultimately decides a future race. But it does show that none of these candidates right now really have an overwhelming amount of support among the public, and most Canadians actually just shrug their shoulders and say, I'm not sure.
Okay, most Canadians shrug their shoulders. Let's bring in another board here, because that's the top line. You also went looking for how much of a positive view participants had about other prominent Liberals. Walk us through those numbers, because I think that seems to very much buttress what you just told us about no one really owning this race.
Yeah, and again, you look at these numbers with Chrystia Freeland having is the most well-known candidate. Fewer people say they don't know her or they don't have an opinion of her than any of the others. Mark Carney comes second on that, but you can see that each of them has some positive impressions, but not a whole lot, right? Even the Deputy Prime Minister, who's been, I would say, the most high-profile cabinet minister in the Trudeau government, she just has 21% have a positive view. In fact, more people have a negative view of Chrystia Freeland than a positive one. Melanie Joly, who's had a very high-profile role as our foreign affairs minister, involved in many issues related to some of the conflicts in Europe and in the Middle East. She's more well-known than some of our other cabinet colleagues, but even there, not a whole lot of positive impressions. And so when I look at those numbers, again, this is among the general public. The conclusion is that none of them, except perhaps for Ms. Freeland, have much profile at all. And so if, let's say, the Prime Minister announced tomorrow he wasn't running again and a leadership race quickly took shape, most, if not all of these potential candidates that we tested in our survey, the first step would be having to introduce themselves to Canadian, and that means both there's an opportunity, that there's a blank slate for them to fill in, but also a risk in that others, like the Conservatives, can shape public perceptions around whoever might become the next leader and prime minister.
Okay, so some opportunity, as you say, for potential runners. But, you know, I'm wondering then, given the pitfall that you outlined, is that some good news then for the Prime Minister? Because if people are uncertain about potential successors, does that bolster the argument that Trudeau is still his party's best known commodity and therefore his party's best asset?
I think it does to some extent. I mean, it's a question of risk in my mind, right? That the risk for the Liberal Party and for the Prime Minister is very clear. People know who the Prime Minister is. They have very clear views on him, and I think it's going to be hard for him, as we've seen, to try to change the public perception of him personally. But the risk on the other end is that likely whoever replaces him won't be well known. Maybe after a leadership race that might change, and so we're just measuring where the kind of start of public views of these candidates might be. But there is a lot of risk that at the end of the day, the Liberals select somebody that many Canadians don't know very much about, and so they'll have to actually spend a lot of time introducing themselves when we know that next election isn't that far away. So the real question is, what's riskier? An unknown potential replacement or a well-known and right now unpopular leader in Mr. Trudeau that the party and Mr. Trudeau himself obviously has to determine what's best for him and for the party going forward.
Well, some very interesting things to consider. David Coletto, always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. Representatives from the Canadian Union of Jewish Students held a news conference this morning. Joined by Liberal and Conservative MPs, they voiced concern over anti-Semitism on Canadian university campuses. Speakers at the press conference detailed their experiences with anti-Semitism at institutions across the country and the impact of pro-Palestinian encampments that have been set up at some schools.
Chants heard throughout this past school year and at the encampment at McGill include, all Zionists are racist. All Zionists are terrorists. There is only one solution, Intifada revolution, and leave Palestine alone and go back to Europe. Just the other day, I was walking to class and I saw a sign that sort of underscored all of this. It said, no Zionists are welcome.
Liberal MP Anthony Housefather says the Justice Committee will study anti-Semitism on college and university campuses in Canada. PSAC President Chris Aylward took aim at the government today, critical of changes to the hybrid work model, which will require federal workers in the office at least 3 times a week starting in the fall. Aylward says the decision was done without any consultation, which contradicts what they heard from the government during contract negotiations last year.
But with its surprise announcement last week, the Trudeau Liberal government broke that promise by changing their mandate without any consultation with workers or their unions, and repeatedly misled unions when they were asked directly if they were going to change their telework policy.
The PSAC, along with 15 other unions, is now launching a legal challenge against the change, and it is also calling on the NDP to break its supply and confidence agreement with the government over the issue. In response, the Treasury Board President Anita Anand said today the government is within its rights and the move does not violate any collective agreement signed last year.
A hybrid work environment is not within the collective agreements. It is something that at the time of the negotiations, the Government of Canada retained prerogative over to determine the scope of the hybrid environment. Thank you.
Well, it's described as the largest mobilization of queer groups in nearly 20 years. Rallies taking place across Canada next week to protest the rise of anti-2S LGBTQIA hate. It's being organized by many community organizations. It also includes the Canadian Labour Congress and Oxfam. Here now is the executive director of one of those groups, Tyler Boyce of the Enchante Network.
Hate is not a partisan issue. No Canadian in this country deserves to feel like they can't leave their house in safety. No worker in this country needs to feel like they can't go to work in safety. But unfortunately today, due to politicians putting us, our communities, my loved ones, as wedge issues in a broader culture war that, like Fae said, Canadians no longer need nor deserve. Folks in my community, our member organizations across the country, don't feel safe to go into work because of their identity.
Well, to talk more about this, we're now joined by Fae Johnstone. She's the Executive Director of the Society for Queer Momentum. Fae, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on today.
Listen, I know that you made your announcement today because Parliament will not be sitting next week, and so you wanted to take advantage of parliamentarians being here. But, you know, the timing is certainly quite pertinent because just yesterday, CSIS released their annual report. And in that report, they warn that there will be violence fueled by anti-gender ideology. Does that conclusion surprise you in any way?
Absolutely not. You know, we've been warning about this for years, and we have all the data to show hate is on the rise. The Overton window is shifting, and it's becoming more normal to direct vitriol towards our trans friends, our queer friends, and there's really a lot at stake here that should concern all Canadians.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us. You're not surprised, you say. So what have you observed? Next year aside, what currently exists right now, the stories that you're hearing that people are sharing with you?
You know, what I'm hearing is stories of parents being doxxed for speaking out to defend their kids. Pride organizers, local LGBT activists are receiving death threats and targeted by this powerful far-right lobby that is really trying to shove us out of public life to make it harder for us to speak our truths. And my worry is that this is just the beginning. You know, we saw 100+ protests at schools, drag events, and in communities across Canada last year. And there's a lot at stake here on our journey towards a more free and equal Canada for all Canadians.
What's the effect on that, on the community then? Because as you say, there have been dozens of these anti-drag storytime protests, for example, across the country, people going to LGBT organizations. What has been the effect then on the level of safety people fear and the freedom with which they feel that they can gather?
I think people are scared. You know, I'm hearing from folks who are worried, again, about their kids going to school. The bullying is rising in those classrooms because of some of the rhetoric that premiers are spreading about our kids. And when you have a government saying it's okay to talk about kids this way, it allows your playground bully to do the same thing. And so we really are seeing a lot of fear and anxiety. But on the flip side, my hope is we're speaking up, we're telling our story, and we're going to show Canadians that my community isn't a threat. We just want to live our lives, pay our bills, contribute to our economy, just like every other Canadian does.
Mm-hmm. Which I'll get to in a moment, but you said something interesting there, that kids can be spoken in this way. In what way are kids being spoken about that endangers them, do you think?
There's this language as if there's, you know, some cult or some ideology being pushed in our schools. And that's actually meant to cause fear and cause anxiety. When actually what we're talking about is efforts to make sure that whether you're a gay kid, a trans kid, a Muslim kid, or a disabled kid, you have the freedom to be yourself at school, that you're safe in that classroom. We participate in Pride Month for the same reason we celebrate Ramadan, to give kids a sense of belonging at school, to let them know that they have every right to be themselves.
Well, you know, you mentioned provincial premiers, and certainly there have been policy debates, federal and provincial, and right now we are hearing premiers across the country talking about trans issues, but they're doing so in the context of parental rights. How do you counter that argument? Because, you know, at the end of the day, if a parent feels that they're going to be disconnected from decisions being made about their child, they're going to push back.
Absolutely. And you know, the first thing to understand is that the overwhelming majority of parents, and more parents than ever before, we know that they support their kids. And we want parents as involved as possible. But what we also know is that trans kids need to be able to come out just like a gay kid would if and when they're ready to do so. And often a kid needs the space to come out at school before they're necessarily ready to come out at home. But our end goal is shared. It is healthy schools, healthy families, and strong relationships that allow young people to be supported by their teachers and by their young folks. The struggle here is these premiers are using a dog whistle. They're poisoning the waters by insinuating that there's something scary or bad. And at the end of the day, that's not what's happening. What's happening is efforts to reduce bullying, to improve, to make kids able to stay at school instead of dropping out, as too many trans kids do. So that's what we need to get back to, is safe schools for all kids and all families.
It's a powerful statement, though, and I think it's building a little bit on what you're saying here, because parental rights, again, how do you tell a parent that they cannot be involved in their child's life? Because that seems to be the implication.
And that is what they're trying to make us think, right? But when you're a teacher and you have a kid come out to you, for example, your first step is to say, thank you for telling me this, for trusting me, and I support you. Your next step is to try to help that kid, if they're not ready to come out, to have that conversation with family. Again, you know, our historic policies in schools have allowed teachers to work with guidance counselors, with mental health professionals, and absolutely with families, so that these conversations can happen and that everyone is safe doing so. And so a lot of it is using this language to roll back and force out efforts to make schools safer for kids. You know, in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, they're making it harder for kids to learn about diverse families, about families with 2 dads or 2 moms, or about folks whose gender just happens to be different from what that doctor when you were born thought it would be.
You know, we could go on in the conversation, but I do have to ask, because you made this announcement because Parliament is sitting this week and not next, but you actually have a week of action slated for the next few days. So talk to us then. What is your bigger strategy? As we hear, you know, people at a very high level, provincial governments, making policies around trans issues, how do you talk about your side of the story? How do you talk about your message up against very established, you know, infrastructure?
What we're talking about is a more free and equal Canada for all of our families, for rainbow equality. You know, I am so proud to live in a country where we have been a bastion, a beacon around the world for marriage equality, for trans rights. We banned conversion therapy. We are building a more free and equal Canada where, regardless of your gender, where regardless of your sexuality, regardless of race and all those other factors, you have that freedom. And so that is our message. The opposition is using misinformation, you know, these misleading slogans, and a whole lot of hateful rhetoric. But we're speaking up for love, for compassion, for diversity, and united our voices are going to get Canada back on track to deliver for everybody and not engage in this discriminatory behavior.
Okay. Fae, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and I hope that we'll have folks across this country tapping into our rallies at www.rainbowequality.ca.
Okay, you got that one in. Thank you for that, Fae Johnstone. And that is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.